To have the chance to welcome George Mitchell back to Harvard Law School is a true honor for me and for the whole school, indeed for the whole university. Program on Negotiation's first honoree in its Great Negotiator Award series, and still to this day, he is the standard setter. This is the person who exemplifies what we admire most in providing the skill, vision, stamina, courage to be a great negotiator. After that award, in the year 2000, of course, George Mitchell has gone on to do many, many things. What we've gone on to do is write case studies about his work as a negotiator and to give students of all ages the chance to study in detail the complex, nuanced activities that led to his great success as a negotiator. I think everyone here knows about his work in the Northern Ireland peace talks, transformative. I'm old enough to remember everyone saying, it'll never happen, it'll never happen, it'll never happen. But George Mitchell's lifetime service in public service is simply extraordinary. He has also recently been U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East. He has engaged in negotiations with the Walt Disney Company. And if you haven't read that story, I highly recommend it. Also worthy of some plots for the Disney films. In addition, this is a man whose work as a lawyer includes his work as a chair of a leading law firm, a judge, oftentimes mentioned person to be appointed to the Supreme Court, and boy, there would have been some good negotiations had you been there. And also someone whose commitment to public service, starting with his Army service, continuing to his work as honorary chair of the World Justice Project, he exemplifies what it is to have the big picture and to have the commitment to making value that benefits everybody. I am so impressed that I believe it's true, Senator Mitchell, that you have visited every single high school in Maine. Is that true? Wow. And that commitment, as you can see, extends into the next generation, supporting scholarships and supporting the ideal of public service and bringing great talent to solve great problems. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Do you want to make a comment now?
Well, let me begin by thanking Dean Minow for the truly generous introduction, to thanking Professor Sebenius, who's written a couple of articles about my work in Northern Ireland, and I told him earlier he was really too kind to me. I speak often, so for me, the introduction is the highlight of the day. It's very nice to hear pleasant things said about you in public in front of a group of people, most of whom you don't know. There's a risk to it, however, that if you hear it often enough, you might begin to believe it, which is a form of mental disease. So I like to begin with a story about introductions and an occasion on which I was brought back down to earth. I spent about 5 years working in Northern Ireland. I chaired 3 separate sets of discussions. When my work was completed, I returned to my home in Maine and wrote a book about that experience. When the book was published, I went on a promotional tour around the country. I received many invitations, and in the process, I learned the interesting fact that in the United States, there are more Irish American organizations than there are Irish Americans. And every one of them invited me to come to speak to their group. I couldn't go to them all, but I went to many. And as I traveled the country, there developed among these groups an informal competition as to who could give the longest, most fantastic, sometimes truly ridiculous introductions of me. The proper reaction, of course, would have been for me to show some humility, to encourage them to keep it short. I had an improper reaction. I loved it. I encouraged them. I scolded them when they left something out. In Chicago, a man got up and spent 35 minutes reading a long list of everything I'd ever done in my life. What was particularly interesting to me was that much of it I'd not been aware of before. But when he finished, I scolded him because he left out the fact that I received the Science Award when I graduated from Waterville High School in Maine many years earlier. So by the time I got to the last stop on this tour, I was overly impressed with myself. It was in Stamford, Connecticut, the Stamford Irish American Society. I had a hard time squeezing my head through the front door. But when I got inside, the first person I encountered was an elderly woman who rushed up to me, very nervous and excited, shook my hand vigorously, almost knocked me over, spent several minutes telling me what a great man I am and how thrilled she was to meet me. And she concluded by saying, I don't live anywhere near here. I just drove across the entire state of Connecticut just to tell you how much I admire you and ask you, please, would you autograph my poster? She handed me a poster with a photograph and a pen. I looked at it. I said, I'd be very happy to sign your poster. I said, but before I do, I think there's something I should tell you. She said, what is it? I said, I'm not Henry Kissinger. There's a big picture of Kissinger. She said, you're not? She said, well, who are you anyway? And when I told her, she said, why, that's just terrible. She said, I drove 3.5 hours to meet a great man named Kissinger, and all I've got is a nobody like you. I said, I'm sorry you feel so bad. I wish there's something I could do. She said, well, there is. And when I asked her what it was, she leaned forward. I leaned forward. Our foreheads were practically touching, and in a conspiratorial whisper, she said, nobody will ever know the difference. She said, would you mind signing Henry Kissinger's name for my poster? And so I did. And it's hanging today in her living room wall in Eastern Connecticut, a daily reminder to me to enjoy but not to take seriously these words of introduction. Now, Kissinger has a history at Harvard, and some of you may know him. So the best part of the story is about a year ago, I was in Manhattan, and Henry and I appeared together at a business conference. It was in a private club at a high-rise building in Manhattan. And it was just like this, 3 chairs, a moderator, he and I, and we got questions about the Middle East and China and world issues. I thought it'd be a good occasion to tell the story I just did, and I told it, and the crowd liked it, and Henry appeared to enjoy it. When we finished the program, we found ourselves together on the elevator going down to the ground floor. And he said to me, you know, he said, I've been with you often in these events. I've heard you speak many times, especially when you're Senate Majority Leader. He said, I have to tell you, your words tonight were the best I've ever heard you speak. He said, you were really good. I said, well, that's very flattering coming from someone like you. I said, was it my answer on China? Was it the Middle East? Oh, no, he said, it was that story you told about me in the beginning. He said, that was really great. You should tell it all over America. And I've been working at it ever since. And now I can add Harvard to my list of Henry promotional events. So anyway, thank you all for being here. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to the conversation.
Well, Senator Mitchell, what a pleasure to welcome you back. It was, in fact, 16 years ago, in the year 2000, that the program on negotiation, which I chair, chose you as our first great negotiator. And since there have been a distinguished number of people who have followed, but none more distinguished than you. In fact, you did, as Dean Minow, set the standard. At that time, in introducing you, I said what a pleasure it was that, in fact, our first recipient, in fact, had legal training and was a lawyer and had been a federal judge, because the program on negotiation, which is interdisciplinary, but I can say here at the law school, we're very committed to the notion that lawyers can be problem solvers. We can be part of the solution, not just those who pump up the adversarial process to inflame conflicts. Today, what we're going to do is focus much of our time on your work in Northern Ireland. We're also going to spend, and my colleague Jim Sebenius will sort of lead our questioning there. We're going to also ask you some questions about the Middle East, where you served as President Obama's special envoy, and some years before that played an interesting role in terms of assessing the causes of what was called the Second Intifada after the collapse of the Camp David Accords. And then we're going to have some more general questions about negotiation generally. So most of all, I just want to say how thrilled we are to have you back here, and we hope you come back often. Jim, why don't you lead off?
It's a great honor. And you're something of a folk hero here, not for the Henry Kissinger piece, though we did honor Henry Kissinger as one of the secretaries of state whom we've asked about their most challenging negotiations. And we'll probably see him pretty soon in Manhattan, and I'm going to bring a photo of you and ask him to sign it.
Well, you know, it's an interesting thing. I just published another book, and I signed a few up front here. And quite frequently, when I do book events, I'm doing one this afternoon in the Newburyport. They have a festival there. I tell the story, and people ask me to sign Kissinger's name in my book. And so I signed many of them, George Mitchell, AKA Kissinger. And so I will be happy to do you. I'm happy that you'll do that.
This is great. Well, I would like to start really early in the process in Northern Ireland, when by what looks a little bit like a subterfuge, Bill Clinton lured you there under the pretext of a short trade-related mission, which turned into a very long process. And pretty quickly, it was obvious that there were huge barriers: deep distrust, history of violence, incompatible position. In that little six-county region, many of the key players had never been in the same room together. And I'm curious, apart from many of the specifics that you did during that process leading to the Good Friday Accords, did you have an overall strategy for overcoming those barriers? What were the broad things that you tried to do to bring these parties together when so many efforts had been made to no success? And even at the very end, if I'm not mistaken, you said a poll was taken a week before the Good Friday Accords were signed, and 83% of the local population said there was no way, even that late in the process. So you faced real barriers. What was your strategy for overcoming those?
I did have an overall strategy, although many of the specific actions over the course of the next several years were reactive to events and sometimes desperate efforts to keep the process together. I had not been to Northern Ireland ever. I had only been to Ireland once for a couple of days, even though my father's parents were born in Ireland, emigrated to the United States. My father was born here in Boston, but never knew his parents. He was raised in an orphanage that then existed at the intersection of Mass and Huntington Avenues in Boston. And he was adopted by an elderly couple who were not Irish. He had no education, and so he had no sense of his Irish heritage. And I didn't have much sense of it when I went there. But I did a lot of studying and reading and research in the first several months I was there before I got directly into the negotiating or peace process, as they called it. And I was aware of the fact that the hostility between the two communities was so deep and so intense that there was a long history of not even talking to each other. You touched upon one of the central elements that created the context within which our effort could succeed, whereas all previous efforts had failed. The previous efforts involved only what are called, in Northern Ireland, the constitutional parties, which means in that context they didn't have militias attached to them. The non-constitutional parties were the political parties on both sides that had militias, the best known of which, of course, is the IRA, affiliated with the political party Sinn Féin. After the last previous effort in the early 1990s had failed, the British and Irish governments did a review of it. And they reached the conclusion that to all of us now will seem so obvious. It's one of those things, why didn't I realize that before? That they had excluded the parties that had militias, and it was the militias who were fighting the war. And the notion that you can end a war by refusing to talk to the people who are fighting the war is, in retrospect, doesn't make much sense. So the British and Irish governments decided that they had to initiate a process in which the parties who had affiliated militias could come into the negotiations. The problem was, given the history, none of the constitutional parties would sit with them. So you would have, if you conducted it that way, the reverse of the problem you had. If you had only those fighting the war and not the major parties that didn't have militias, you couldn't possibly reach an agreement. So the challenge became, how do you get the parties that had militias affiliated into the talks and keep the other parties in? And so I'd served for about 3 years as a United States attorney in Maine, and I'd spent much of my time in court trying cases, and then I was a federal judge after that for a relatively short period, presiding over cases. And so I had some sense of how you ought to conduct an adversarial process where people compete, but also within some set of rules. And so my long-range goal was to figure out a way how I could establish a context within which these two groups, really 4 groups, 2 on each side, the constitutional and the militia-based parties in each of the 2 communities, could come together and talk and actually listen to each other, because I learned very early that the dramatic walkout is a standard practice in Northern Ireland. One side would stand up and make a very dramatic and emotional statement and then throw down a bunch of papers and books on the table and storm out before the other side had a chance to respond. And the other side would perform the same act, and there was a lot of invective and insulting statements made back and forth. And I actually started a practice. I told them about some of the operations of the U.S. Senate. I'd been majority leader for 6 years. And in the Senate, there's something called the morning hour. It's not limited to an hour, but that's how it began. And it began in the mornings where there's no legislation pending. Any senator can come in that wants to and say whatever they want. And they're just ordinarily speeches about subjects that are of interest to senators politically. And so I said, when we get into this, I said, why don't we do something like that? So you guys come in here and get it out of your system, let it all out, and then we'll try to get down to the business of the day. It was aggravated by the fact that right outside the gate, the negotiations took place in a compound which had been British government office buildings, where for 25 years the British government had directly run Northern Ireland, and they ran it from a compound where the civil servants worked. The government erected a gate around it, established certain protections for the venue from terrorist or other form of attack, and that's where we conducted the negotiation. But right directly adjacent to the main gate, a press compound was established. So every morning when the delegates to the peace talk walked in, and every evening when they walked out, they went through this gauntlet of television and news reporters. And of course, the question would be asked, well, he said that last night. You don't agree with that, do you? Somebody made a proposal. You'd never sign on to that, would you? And then you'd come out and the same thing in reverse. So people got locked into positions. And sometimes the questions weren't 100% accurate as to what someone else said, and it sort of escalated. So I let them in, and I'd say, I wanted to encourage people actually listen to the other side. So it started with, we spent a couple hours every day, and I usually was the only person who sat through the whole thing. Each side weighing in on what someone said on television last night, what was in the paper this morning, what aggravated them, what concerned them, and then I try to get them focused on business. So originally it was just to create a context within which serious, genuine discussion could occur, and people would actually, for many of them, for the first time in their lives, listen to someone in the physical presence of the opposition. Actually listen. That's really why it took so long. It took years and years to get them to the point where they would actually sit and negotiate on issues. The real negotiations, as you pointed out in your article, were just in the last month or so. The rest of it was conditioning them to get into a process that was serious, where they would listen to the other side, try to understand their views, try to accommodate their positions. It was very, very hard to do. That was my one goal, although I confess to you, I never dreamed that it would last that long. When the Prime Minister Major called me in the spring of 1996 and said that my earlier report on the decommissioning of weapons had served as the basis on which the parties agreed to the talks. So he said, well, we all agree you're the logical guy to chair the talks. And I said, well, Prime Minister, I've already been involved. President Clinton originally told me a few months. Now it's been a year and a half. I said, how long do you think it's going to take? He said, oh, you'll be home by Christmas. Years later, he said to me, well, I never said which Christmas. And it was several years later. So it took a long time, but in the end, it worked out.
So two key elements. One, get the right parties. And second, and something you said that I loved, it's not so hard to get people to talk to each other, but to get them to listen to each other is the trick.
Yeah.
Getting the right parties together, a block, was decommissioning, because the Protestants, the so-called Unionists, and John Major, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, said decommissioning of weapons is an absolute precondition to negotiation. And you had to get past that barrier.
Yes.
How'd you do it?
Well, that was very difficult. I chaired with my two colleagues who were with me all the way, the former Prime Minister of Finland, Harry Holkeri, who was chosen by the Irish government, and the former Canadian Chief of the General Staff and later Ambassador to the United States, John de Chastelain, which was chosen by the British government, and I was sort of the chair and the neutral, so-called neutral in it. We, at the request of the two governments, we conducted an inquiry on the issue of prior decommissioning, prior disarmament in more plain English. And just about everyone told us it was impossible, including many of the people in the British government who supported the Prime Minister. The British had got themselves out on a limb, and essentially we were asked to figure out a way off the limb. When the Prime Minister heard from some of his colleagues that we might be considering not endorsing prior decommissioning, he called me and asked me to come to his office at 10 Downing Street. And he was very direct and said to me, if you don't endorse prior decommissioning, I'm not going to accept the report. And I said to him, well, I said, you have to do your job and I have to do mine. And I said, you asked me to conduct an independent inquiry. That is what we're doing, and we're going to make the conclusions what we think ought to be done. And what we did was we did not endorse prior decommissioning because it would have been pointless. I talked with a fellow from the United Nations who I did a lot of research on the subject, and he had worked in El Salvador, and he had proposed what he calls sequencing or parallel decommissioning. You could have talks, and while the talks were going on, you could get the decommissioning as you reach certain phases in the talks. And so we adopted that. And then we knew that would not solve the issue for the British government. So there was a related issue that was very difficult in that the Unionists wanted an election in which anyone who wanted to be part of the negotiations would have to be elected. That is, you didn't have appointed delegates to a peace conference. And they wanted what they called a forum, which was a legislative body created for the purpose of discussing it. Well, having a huge elected forum was also a prescription for disaster. The nationalists were adamantly opposed to an election on the logical grounds that if you have an election, it's polarizing. People make the most extreme statements. They're pressured by their constituents to take extreme positions. So it's the worst possible prelude to a negotiation to have these people elected in this context. So we devised a mechanism in which there would be an election, a forum would be elected, but the forum itself would not be the negotiation. From the delegates to the forum, a smaller subset would be selected by the parties to represent them in the negotiations. It was a complex compromise, but it enabled the British to get off the hook. Major, on the first day in the House of Commons, effectively denounced our report. But within weeks, he figured out, I had many talks with him, that you could say, and he did say publicly, that yes, we want prior decommissioning, but there are two routes to a negotiation. One is decommissioning, and one is through an elected forum from which delegates would be selected. And so he was able to move a little bit. The nationalists moved a little bit. The forum was elected. It became basically just a talking shop that withered away after a while, and the delegates of the talks were chosen, and we were able to get started in that way. So it was devising a mechanism that tried to enable the political leaders to take steps that they had previously been against without completely losing face. I had been a politician. I recognized that you're asking people to do things that are unpopular with their constituencies. You have to create a rationale for it. There has to be a logical basis of doing it. You have to identify some greater good that they're going to gain. And that's the way we managed it. It's far more complicated than I've described. It would take the whole period here to get into all of the mechanics of it. But it was an ingenious process that my colleagues and I worked out with the help, I have to say, among the most talented men and women I have ever met were the secretariats, the civil servants of both Britain and Ireland who were involved in this process. Many of them had been involved for 25 years in trying to deal with this issue. They knew everything about it, and they were brilliant in the innovation that they brought to the task of how to maneuver around these deeply set in concrete differing terms that the two sides had. And they helped us construct this elaborate process.
So this is really elegant in a way, because you had, as we do in so many difficult negotiations, absolutely incompatible positions. The Unionists and John Major said, it's a precondition that decommissioning has to take place. And you actually broadened that in a way that gave you representation that was actually legitimate. Because there was an election behind it. And if I remember right, there was a third issue. You sort of gave John Major a package. There were the forum elections, and also everybody had to adhere to what came to be called the Mitchell Principles of Democracy and Nonviolence.
That's right.
So you turned a single issue into three, and those gave you a claim to moderation and representation.
That's right. Because we knew that the Unionists wanted prior decommissioning, we had to figure out some way to enable them to stay in the talks without prior decommissioning. So I conceived a set of principles of nonviolence that said that any party entering the talks, and this was directed specifically at the parties with militias, had to commit to nonviolence, to accepting the democratic will of the people, I was clear in saying that they could continue to advocate for their position. The Nationalists still want a united Ireland in which all of Ireland is one nation. The Unionists still want Northern Ireland to be part of the United Kingdom with England, Scotland, and Wales, and they can still advocate for it, but they have to do so through peaceful democratic means, not through violence. And I required each party to come into the negotiations, to stand in front of me, and to make a specific pledge to me, my colleagues, and in front of all of the other delegates, that they would adhere to those, and then they had to go out and have a press conference and say it publicly. I just sort of made that procedure up to give it some sense of gravity and seriousness so that they would know that they were making a commitment that they had to keep. The other thing I should comment, because you talked about ingenious things, this came from a couple of British civil servants. In the issue of elections, there were 5 parties in Northern Ireland, 2 nationalist or Catholic parties, 2 unionist parties, and then a 5th party, the Alliance, which sought support from both communities. It was relatively small. They never got 10% of the vote. The problem was, how do we get, on the unionist side, the political parties that were associated with militias, who were the counterparts to the IRA and Sinn Féin on the national side. Sinn Féin is a big party. We knew they'd get in on their own, but the unionist paramilitary parties were very small and unlikely to make it into an elected forum and therefore not into the negotiations. So we devised a system. Since there were 5 parties, we said that the 10 parties with the most votes would get into the forum. Well, there were only 5 parties. So that made it possible for the unionists to get in, some of them with 1% of the vote. A beneficial effect of that, not the original intent, was that the women in Northern Ireland, who turned out to be a major factor in the process, created a women's party, and with 0.85% of the vote, they got into the forum and into the negotiations. So we broadened the base in a way that got in the unionist parties, even though in voting terms they were not anyway comparable to Sinn Féin and the IRA, but they were there. They were on equal footing in terms of being able to talk. The women came in. They produced, were significant factors in the process in terms of attitude, although not in voting weight. And so it was an ingenious mechanism that solved the problem it intended to solve and another problem that we weren't even aware of at the time.
Since I wrote the article you mentioned, I've been appropriately criticized for leaving out the role of the Women's Coalition. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little. What did they do that was helpful? Because subsequently, people have said, far disproportionate to the size,
yeah.
Their influence, especially later in the process, was significant.
It was in part symbolic. There are 2 outstanding women. Monica McWilliams is a Catholic. She's a college professor, a well-educated, articulate woman, a tremendous woman. She co-chaired it with a woman named Pearl Sager. No higher education, a housewife, one of the best, most courageous women I've ever met. And the 2 of them were a perfect pair. And so they were symbolic. When they first started, some of the men were quite rude to them. They weren't used to having women playing prominent roles in politics. And I didn't have a heavy hand usually in the process, but I was very direct and stern, saying that nobody was going to be insulted when they spoke, and especially women were not going to be insulted while they spoke. And I made sure that when they talked, people could walk out, and many of them did, but those who stayed had to listen, and they had to treat the women with the same degree of respect that the men received. That was an important step, and they gradually got to be quite a force because they were one of the few groupings in the talks that drew support from both sides of the aisle. And they represented the tremendous longing for women for an involvement in bringing about peace, because the level of fear and anxiety that hung over the society was truly heavy and severe as the conflict evolved. You have to keep in mind that when this latest outbreak of violence started, the late 60s and early 70s, the IRA said they would target only military targets. And they defined military as the British Army or the Northern Ireland Police Force. But gradually, whatever discipline there was dissolved and the targets began to expand. In retaliation, the Unionist paramilitaries, who felt that the British Army was not sufficiently strict with the IRA, organized, and they did not limit it to military targets. So as the conflict proceeded, as always happens in conflict, it became increasingly savage, increasingly widespread. People were being killed for no other reason than they were living in a Catholic area or a Protestant area. Killings were retaliatory. It was common for a gunman to burst into a restaurant or a bar or a theater with guns and just spray the audience because they knew, based on geography, that it was an audience of Catholics or an audience of Protestants. And as that occurred, the fear and the anxiety became much greater. It's one thing when your country or your whatever your social unit is fighting a war and the battle lines are clearly defined and the army's in the field and you're living your life back home and following the news, but you don't have any real fear or stake. It's another thing when it's on a daily basis and it can happen anywhere. It could happen to anyone. And that led women into the process, and the Northern Ireland's Women's Party created an outlet and a vehicle for all of that intense political feeling to be focused. And so they did make a good contribution to the process.
So 2 questions. You got, by way of the parallel decommissioning, the forum elections, and the Mitchell principles, you finally got the representation that was critical. And the Mitchell principles might have just sounded like vague and kind of hortatory. But in fact, at some critical points in the negotiations, parties not only had walked out, but were excluded for violating those principles. And the 2 questions I'd like to ask is, once you got the election, or once you got the process going, could you describe what it was like to go into that room the first time? And because I understand that Reverend Paisley was not quiet.
No.
Ever. The second thing is to jump back a little bit later when some parties were excluded and how that either helped or hurt the negotiations. So what was it like walking into that room?
Well, the first day, we began on June 10th. It was a Monday. Prime Minister Major came, the Irish Prime Minister, John Bruton, came, and there was an army of press and television. It was a big event, and they made great positive speeches, and they left. And I was then to become the chairman, but the parties, some of them were protesting the fact that I was being imposed upon them, and worse still, God forbid, not only was I imposed by the governments, but I was an American, 1 strike, a Democrat, 2 strikes, a Catholic, you're out. So they really, many of them were extremely hostile to my participation. So for the first 2 days, going through much of the night, a lengthy debate ensued on my fitness for the position. And I wasn't in the room, we were across the hall, and the British government had rigged up a sound thing. So I sat there for 2 days and listened to people debate my fitness to this process. I thinking, what am I doing here? Why am I doing this? It was really kind of surreal. Finally, after 2 days and evenings of this, at 12:30 in the morning, the British Secretary of State came in.
Middle of the night, right?
In the middle of the night, 12:33 a.m., walked into the room. He said, "We're going in." Sounded like an invasion of a foreign territory. So we walked in this large room with a large rectangular table, probably 75 people in the room. Remember, there were 10 political parties, 2 governments, and the chairman. and they had an elaborate chair set up for me as the chairman with a big sign in front of it right in the middle of one end of the table. And as I walked in, I saw someone sitting in my chair. And I walked over to him. It was a British civil servant. He said, I'm holding your chair so they don't capture it. So we executed this maneuver where just as he jumped up, I slid in so nobody else could grab the seat. Dr. Paisley and members of his unionist party and another smaller party that were allied with them were on the side of the room, really not far, just about where the front row is sitting here. And they were all standing and chanting in very loud unison, no, 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 in opposition to me. I sat down. Before I said a word, Dr. Paisley launched into a blistering attack on the British government, the Irish government, me, the whole process. It went on for quite a long time. And then he and his colleagues slammed down their papers and they all walked out. So about an hour had elapsed. I had not said a word, and it was now about 1:30. So I didn't want to stop right then because I knew that would be a defeat. So I tried and made semblance of a reasonable argument on why we're here, the importance of peace, and so forth and so on, just to try to make it clear that the peace process had begun. And after about another hour or so, I adjourned the meeting and called for it to resume at 11 o'clock that same morning. I went and I slept for a couple of hours. Then I got up and I called Paisley, and I called the other party leader, Bob McCartney. And I said, look, you've made your point. I understand you're opposed to me, but I'm seated. A process is underway. I think at the very least you ought to come back and give it a try. You can always walk out again. You can walk out every day. In fact, they did quite often. I said, but we're going to start at 11 o'clock. And I said, it's in your interest to come there, because how do you know what we're going to do if you're not there to protect your interests? And sure enough, they came. They came back at 11 o'clock, and we resumed the process. And so we had it sort of underway. What I thought of at the time, it's kind of funny. I thought of the Wright brothers trying to get the airplane off the ground on the sands of the beaches of North Carolina. And I thought to myself, if those two guys could get that plane off the ground, I can get this process off the ground somehow or other. And I had a lot more difficulty than they did. And we finally did get it going.
So they walked out, but a few times they were excluded. I don't think by
Yes.
you, but by the sponsoring
Yes,
governments,
yes.
which kind of protected you.
Right.
How important was their walking out or their being excluded at key points to making progress?
It was very difficult. We had the Mitchell principles, and the delegates, although they were all elected officials, many of the members of parliament locally, a few of them were lawyers, but they were very prone to legal words and utterings, much of which they didn't believe. Point of order was there. I must have heard 8,000 points of order raised when I was there. Mr. Chairman, point of order, point of order. They tried to interrupt the other guy. And they liked to speak in legalese. You know, we demand an indictment of the other side. Well, not a formal indictment. We demand the expulsion of the other side. We demand adherence. And it got sort of to be a quasi-legal process. In fact, a couple of times to sort of further that notion, I prepared written opinions on critical issues. Not that it was required. It wasn't a legal process. It was a political process, but it added gravity to the decision and variously pleased or displeased the prevailing or non-prevailing faction. But in the end, in a peculiar, unanticipated way, it really helped me. Many of the unionists were opposed to me on the basis of my background. It lasted so many years. I made so many decisions. Dozens of times a day I had to decide one way or the other, this point of order, that complaint, this indictment, that other thing. And I'd been a federal judge, and I sort of knew how to at least make rational decisions. And some went one way, some went the other way, and gradually their opposition to me dissolved because they began to see that I was not there with one agenda on my mind, that I did decide things reasonably fairly. So when we get to the end of the process, years later, when I shifted my role from that of neutral arbiter to advocate, we drafted, I wrote down what became the peace agreement. When I then advocated for it, I gained the trust of all of them. We actually became quite good friends. Dr. Paisley and I had a very good relationship at the end. And so I didn't like that process because it was so long, it went on for years, but in a sense, in retrospect, it was very helpful to me.
And one last question before we move to the Middle East. A lot of commentators at the time said that after this long process, 3 years to discuss the way that you would enact procedures, and then a year on the procedures, and then 5 or 6 months on the provisional agenda and so forth, and only a couple weeks really on the substance, that process itself began to melt some of the utter adversarial quality that was there. But many people have indicated or have written that you imposed a deadline to bring this to some closure. Could you elaborate that? Because it strikes us that it's hard to impose something without any formal power. But how did this happen?
I did not impose it. I had no formal power. I had to persuade them to accept it. We had a particularly rancorous period in January of 1998. It began 2 days after Christmas the previous year, when a prominent Protestant paramilitary leader was murdered in prison by a group of Catholic prisoners. Although both sides had said they were on a ceasefire, there had been continuous violence throughout at a low level. But this touched off an immediate retaliatory round of tit-tat. That next day, a Catholic was murdered. That night, a Protestant was murdered. Then 2, then 3, then 4. The British government and the Irish governments, in desperation, moved the talks to London, then to Dublin, but it went downhill rapidly. And on the flight from Dublin back to New York in February, I thought the process was just about at the end. And in desperation, I devised the concept of an early, total, unbreakable deadline to force them into a decision. I had no authority to do it, but I literally, on the flight, I had a yellow pad, I wrote it out in hand, and then I spent about 2 months going to each party separately, one-on-one, to persuade them to agree to a deadline. That was really difficult because I got through the British government, the Irish government, and it's like pick up sticks. You get to the third guy, he wants a change, now you got to go back to the first guy to get that change. Then you go around, you get to the sixth guy, then he wants a change, and you got to go back to the beginning. I went around and around. It took me 2 months every day, 12 hours a day, change this word, change that. But finally, they agreed, and I knew then we had a chance because any one of them who refused to agree to a deadline could have disrupted the process, and I thought it would end. And I think what has been underestimated in all of the analysis is the fear factor. For years, they and other people in Northern Ireland had been saying to me, you have to make it work, because if this process fails, there's going to be a new outbreak of violence, far worse than anything before. Both sides were heavily armed. They were ready to go on a moment's notice. And everybody knew that if it failed, that was going to happen. So having heard it so much from them, I used that in persuading them. And I said to every one of them, I said, you've spent your life in politics. Not a thing you have ever done will be remembered. If this process fails and war breaks out, you'll be remembered for only one thing. You permitted the slaughter to occur. You participated in leading this society to the point where many people are going to die, far more than ever before. And there was a palpable fear that this would break out and be horrific, far worse than it had been, and it had been very bad. much has been written about the fact that not that many people were killed in Northern Ireland, about 3,500. What has not been well known is that there was a degree of savagery in beatings and maimings that permanently crippled people for life that included large numbers of people. The car bomb was invented in Northern Ireland. Kneecapping was invented in Northern Ireland, where you fire bullets into the knees and in many cases both ankles of a person, thereby ensuring they would be permanently crippled. The degree of savagery in some of the maiming was horrific. I'd met many of the victims of this in the process. And so I knew it was going to be a terrible, terrible situation. So these political leaders were in a very tough spot, not wanting to take a political risk that would cost them their careers, but fearing the absence of it might cost them and their family their lives. And many of them did have their careers ended. David Trimble's career came to an end because he courageously led the Unionists to an agreement. John Hume's political party went into eclipse. The two centrist parties,
Moderates.
the two centrist parties that did the most work in getting the agreement went into steep decline after the agreement, and the two more extreme parties, who had been the most difficult in the process, one had walked out, in effect, have run the government that was formed in part over their opposition. Jack Kennedy said, life is unfair, and political life is really unfair, and you can see the product of that. But history will judge that those who entered in the agreement were the ones who deserve the approval of their people, whatever the immediate politics may have been in the aftermath of the agreement.
So we'll switch to the Middle East, but what happened, it sounds like, is that initially the extremes had voice and there was no meaningful center, and by the end of the process, people had come to trust you. You'd obviously made great personal sacrifices to stay with the process, that you crafted at least a workable center, and things took a long time to stop the violence. But the result, relative to how it had been, is virtually miraculous, and we are inspired by this.
Yes, but let me make one additional comment. On the first day, that night when I was there, among the things I said to the delegates was that whatever you may read in the papers or hear on television, I have not come here with an American peace plan. There is no Clinton plan. There is no Mitchell plan. This is your country. These are your negotiations. And if there is to be an agreement, it will be your agreement. Years later, when we drafted the agreement, I was made a point that every single word in the agreement had been spoken or written by someone from Northern Ireland. And when I distributed it to them in writing, I sent out a cover memo. And I said, I told you this would be your process and this agreement is yours. Every word in it is yours. And I said to them in that last meeting, I said, when this is over, I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm going home. I'm not going to be living with the consequences of it. You are. So this is your process. You own it. Make sure that you make it work. And they are the ones who deserve the credit. They recognize the importance to their society of making this change. They took, and look, it's very popular in every society to demean, ridicule, insult politicians. Northern Ireland's no different from any other place. They're constantly complaining about their political leaders. And look, we all know some of it's deserved, given the kind of political leadership we have in some areas of our life. But there are great moments in history when ordinary men and women, and these are essentially what we would think of as state legislators, ordinary men and women, rose to the occasion, found within themselves a courage that I think many of them didn't even know they had, to take this leap of faith. And 18 years later, it's worked out. The agreement did not, in and of itself, guarantee peace, political stability, reconciliation. That's a long way to come. Reconciliation is the hardest. It's changing what's in people's hearts and minds. That's the most difficult thing. You can build a bridge, you can rebuild a building, you can create an institution, but changing what's in people's hearts and minds is the most important. Takes longer, takes generations, but overall the peace is held. It's a much more prosperous society. Still many problems, still largely segregated, but the people who did that were the political leaders of Northern Ireland.
In our field of conflict resolution, when one looks internationally at the last half of the 20th century, there are two remarkable success stories. One, of course, is South Africa, where an apartheid regime was dismantled and they moved to a constitutional form of government without a civil war. And the second, of course, was the resolution of the conflict in Northern Ireland in terms of the ending of essentially the end of the violence, and a process that allowed at least the prospect of a civilized political evolution. We're now going to turn to what many see as the most intractable current conflict, and it's one where you've played a role. We're not going to have time to explore your role in terms of the fact-finding committee in 2001, but we would like to spend a few minutes on your role in the early years of President Obama's administration. In January of 2009, literally 2 days after President Obama was inaugurated, he called Senator Mitchell, and along with Secretary of State Clinton, to the State Department, and he was appointed special envoy to the Middle East, signaling President Obama's commitment to American efforts to facilitate resolution. Now, at a superficial level, there are, of course, similarities between the two conflicts. Terrific, I think the greatest similarity, in my view, is the internal conflicts within each society, the internal conflicts among Israelis, or among Israeli Jews, is so profound that for a political leader to make courageous moves is very risky. Rabin's assassination is a reminder of that. Among the Palestinians, the question of whether there's going to be one or two Palestinian states is a real question, because the Palestinian Authority does not have responsibility over Gaza. This, of course, was also true in Northern Ireland, where the internal conflicts among Catholics and among Protestants was very deep. I guess, let me open with a broad question. What lessons did you take from your experience in Northern Ireland that you thought might be useful in thinking about the barriers that needed to be overcome for there to be progress in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute?
In my view, each situation is unique. Think about the fact there are 7.5 billion people in the world, and not one of them is exactly like you. No two conflicts are the same. There are superficial similarities that people always cite: religion, territory, national identity, but each is a product of a long history. There exists in the Middle East, even more than in Northern Ireland, a deep and profound sense of victimization on both sides. And victimization liberates people from restraints that they might otherwise have. I'll go directly to the point that you made about political leaders and the divisions of societies. I spent a great deal of time separately with Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas. As you pointed out, both societies are divided. Among the Palestinians, Fatah, the dominant party, which is represented by the Palestinian Authority, the President Abbas and the executive department, have long ago committed themselves to nonviolence, have recognized Israel, and have served to restrain efforts to engage by Palestinians to engage in terror attacks, more Hamas-based, within the area under their jurisdiction in the West Bank. Hamas, on the other hand, does not recognize Israel, insists on retaining the use of force against what they regard as an illegal occupation, and is not committed to the continuation of prior agreements. Fatah is. So there's a deep division in Palestinian society. There's an equally deep division in Israeli society. The formal position of the government, of the prime minister, at this moment is for a two-state solution, but the prime minister campaigned initially against a two-state solution, and he's made statements, as we know, on both sides of the issue, which call in, on the Palestinian side, doubt about his true intentions. But right now, his position is that there can be a two-state at an appropriate time. Israeli society is deeply divided. There are, within the current government, ministers outspokenly say that there will never be a Palestinian state on the West Bank, and they'll do everything possible to prevent that from occurring. There's a substantial segment of Israeli public opinion who still believes in a two-state solution as the only feasible alternative for Israel. So, if you are a political leader, like Netanyahu or Abbas, you know that any step you take, any perceived concession that you make, is going to be the subject of intense criticism within your own society. In order to enter into talks, therefore, you have to have a belief that it's going to lead somewhere. Why undergo all the political flack that you're going to take if you don't think the process is going to work? And neither of them thinks the process is going to work. I'm now rendering an opinion. I believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu does not believe that President Abbas has either the personal or the political strength to enter into a, quote, reasonable agreement or to implement it, and therefore is unwilling to take whatever political risks are involved for a process that he sees cannot end on satisfactory terms. I believe that President Abbas believes that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not serious about a two-state solution, and that he doesn't really believe it, and he only says it to placate the United States. So he is unwilling to take the enormous political risks that it would entail for him for a process that he believes cannot succeed because of the other guy. Both sides believe the same. In that circumstance, getting people to take huge political risks is very difficult. It's an extraordinary situation where the end result is reasonably well known on both sides. You go back to the so-called Clinton parameters, you go back to the George W. Bush roadmap, you go back to President George W. Bush's speech to Palestinians and Israelis in January of 2008, about a year before he left office. You go back to a number of what they call track 2 proposals, academics, others. You combine them all and you can see roughly the outlines of where this would work out. It's getting there that's the problem. Many political leaders on both sides said to me, Senator, if you can construct a building or a tunnel where no word will ever get out, and we'll walk in one door and there won't be a mention in the press or anything until we walk out the other door with an agreement, that's the only way it can succeed. Well, that's not possible. You know, when I left the position of Senate Majority Leader, I had a very low opinion of the American press and media. Then I went to Britain and Ireland. And the American media moved up a rung because they were displaced at the bottom by the British and Irish media. And then I went to the Middle East. And the other two moved up a couple of rungs when they were displaced at the bottom there. I mean, we have to have a free press. We know that. It's essential to our way of life. But the press is like lawyers and doctors and plumbers and others. There are good ones and there are not so good ones. There are honest ones and there are some that are not honest. And the net effect makes it very difficult when you're engaged in peace talks. You know, at one point in Northern Ireland, the two leaders, David Trimble and Jerry Adams, came to me and said, we can't continue. We can't make it work here because every day the media are demanding, you won't agree to this, you won't agree to this. Senator, they said, we want you to find a place where we can go and have nobody know where we are so we can sit and talk rationally. Now, they like to come to the United States, so I tried to arrange for them to come to the United States. So the British and Irish governments didn't want to pay that. They're paying the bills. They said, you find a place in the British Isles. So we found the U.S. ambassador's residence in London, a beautiful spot that had just been renovated. And we spent a week there before the press found us, and we got a lot done. And in the Middle East, everything is leaked almost immediately. And it's very, very difficult for the political leaders. And if you don't think it's going to work, you're not going to take the risk. You're not going to take the step to the risks involved. It may not be possible until you get new leaders. Who knows whether they will have the bringing it all into sync, into rhyme. You know, in Northern Ireland, we talked about this. What we didn't say is, right at the very end, on the very last day to the very last minute, we came this close to failing. This close. When the phone rang in my office at 10 minutes of 5, where I was to receive the verdict of the Ulster Unionist Party, I didn't know what they were going to say. And I was fearful that they were going to say no. And if they'd said no, the process was over. They had a very difficult internal caucus. Took them all day, and by that margin we prevailed. So this stuff isn't easy, and it's much tougher in the Middle East. However, I do believe that in the end, societies like individuals act out of self-interest. To discern the self-interest at any given time is extremely difficult. The societies are divided, highly politicized, deeply polarized. But in the end, the two-state solution has survived only because no credible or feasible alternative has been presented over all of these years. 12 presidents, 20 secretaries of state, innumerable Israeli prime ministers and Arab leaders and envoys from the US haven't been able to make it work, but there isn't a feasible alternative. Every alternative that's been suggested is less feasible, less practical, less attainable. So I think, and I think fairly soon, because the demographics are going to be decisive by about the year 2020, that they'll come to the conclusion that this is painful, it's difficult, it isn't everything that we want, but it's better than the alternatives. And I think they will come around to some kind of agreement, and I think it will take American leadership, American direct involvement, and American assistance, financial, military, diplomatic, and everything else that's involved.
In 2001 and 2002, did your experience as the special envoy, when you look back on it now, persuade you that the United States wanted talks more than the leaders on either side wanted them? No. And that is not a very promising context for the U.S. to try to promote negotiations?
I would state it in slightly different terms. Both sides are keenly aware of the American political scene, the American political situation, American policy in the region, and they know that the United States wants to be helpful, and like anyone in any discussion or negotiation, they want to leverage it to the highest possible degree to their benefit. That's human nature. That's understandable. You look in today's New York Times, there's an article, a big article, about President Obama is offering an extension of the agreement between the United States and Israel. He's proposing amounts of assistance in financial terms far larger than anything ever in the past, and the Prime Minister is holding out for a little more. Well, that's human nature. It shouldn't surprise anybody. And both sides know that we want to do things, we want to be helpful, we would like to get an agreement, and they try to exercise what leverage they have, and it varies from time to time, to get the maximum amount they can in whatever form that the discussion is then taken. That's not surprising. We ought to understand that, accept that. We ought to act in a mature and responsible way, do the best we can, consistent with our policy in the region. And our policy was set forth most clearly and persuasively, in my judgment, by President George W. Bush in his speech in Jerusalem in January of 2008. And what he essentially said was to the Israelis, you have a state, a very successful state. What you do not have is security for your people. The people of Israel live in fear and anxiety, even more intense in recent months, as we know from the random attempts to kill and injure Israelis that have been occurring. And so you need security, and the only way you can get it is through the creation of a Palestinian state. To the Palestinians, he said, you don't have a state and you want one, and the only way you can get it is if the people of Israel have reasonable and sustainable sense of security. And so President Bush argued, you should each be vested in each other's success because it's the only way you can get what you want. That's American policy. Has been now for a long time, and I think it's the right policy. I think it's a correct analysis. And I think ultimately the publics on both sides will come to recognize that it's in their interest and take the steps necessary. How, under what circumstances, under what leadership, that's difficult to foresee.
And I guess in looking back, what I wonder is, in terms of process, during 2001 and 2002, we weren't able to really secure agreement from the parties as to the most basic elements of the process. The Israelis were insisting on face-to-face negotiations. The Palestinians wanted what turned into proximity talks, and that is an American mediator meeting separately, shuttling back and forth, learning what each side might offer. The Israelis wanted to offer nothing in writing and to all be oral. They never presented a position. Yeah. The Palestinians wanted everything in writing, and in fact, what they were providing in writing, though, you described as all the old stuff.
Same.
The same old stuff they had offered before. There really was no movement. And it wasn't until the very end when efforts to involve the Jordanian and Egyptian leadership provided somewhat more cover for the Palestinians that there were any face-to-face meetings at all. Then there were only 4.
That's right.
And you participated in 3 of those 4, and they couldn't agree as to what would be discussed at those 4. Netanyahu wanted security first, and I'm not entirely sure, but it appeared that Abu Mazen really was prepared to talk about borders.
That's right.
Earlier.
Yeah.
What are the lessons there? If the United States is again called upon to mediate, before a president and a special envoy invests political capital in the process, should we demand more?
Yeah. Yeah. Let me comment first on what you said. There were 4 meetings. I attended all 4, but in the first one, after the meeting, there were only 4 people, Abbas, Netanyahu, Secretary Clinton, and myself. After the first meeting, Abbas and Netanyahu met separately by themselves. And then the second and third and fourth meetings, it was all the 4 of us. You're correct. The Prime Minister insisted that there be nothing in writing. President Abbas presented him with a set of documents, and it was kind of an awkward moment, but the Prime Minister finally took him and laid him on the floor. And they were basically the same documents that the Palestinians had submitted to the Israelis in the Annapolis process under Bush. So the Israelis knew everything that was in the documents, a few dates and things were changed, but they were essentially the same set of documents. It is also true that Prime Minister Netanyahu insisted that only security be discussed, and in the fourth meeting, that was the discussion. Now, ironically, although he'd said there should be nothing in writing, he had a long prepared statement that he then read off to President Abbas on the Israeli demands on security, almost all of which Abbas rejected. There was some discussion, but I wouldn't call it an engagement in dialogue. We had hoped that getting them together would create a traction and an incentive for them to continue. Unfortunately, what happened was just the opposite. Their concerns about the other were validated and reduced the interest in continuing. President Obama had asked earlier for a freeze on Israeli settlements. He was deluged with criticism, including in the United States, although President Bush, just a few years earlier, had asked for the exact identical thing, word for word the same. And many people who supported President Bush and didn't criticize him for asking for a settlement freeze denounced Obama for the same thing. Commentary on how where you sit depends upon your influences, your views on actions that are taken, not the substance of the actions. I negotiated with the Israelis for a period of several months, and they did agree to a 10-month moratorium on new housing construction starts, which, while admittedly far short of the total freeze that we requested, was a very significant action. If extended, it would have brought ultimately to a complete end the construction of housing and settlements. And so I felt it was an accomplishment. I felt that while we'd hoped for a full freeze, it was a significant action. The Palestinians denounced it as worse than useless. 9 months later, we got into the talks. That was a big problem. The Palestinians should have come in earlier. But when they came in, Abbas said, we can only continue if the moratorium is extended. Well, he said an extension of the moratorium is indispensable. And I asked, how could something go from worse than useless to indispensable in 9 months? But the Prime Minister refused to extend it. And so the talks ended without really reaching any agreement. And my agenda had been that we would devote the first session to security, which is what the Israelis wanted, and we did have a session on security. Unfortunately, it consisted largely of Netanyahu saying what he wanted to Abbas. I had hoped that the next session would be on borders, which is what the Palestinians wanted to talk about, setting a border around the territory. I think the way to proceed, and the only way that it's going to bring about a result, is first if two leaders are willing to engage, reflecting what I said earlier about the two not now willing to engage. And secondly, we asked President Obama's policy, which I believe was a sound one, although I personally did a poor job of articulating it, and I think others in the administration did. We asked each side for something to try to create an atmosphere where reasonable talks could occur. Remember, when Obama took office, the war in Gaza had ended 4 days earlier. Thousands had been killed. Israel had been endured thousands of rockets being launched into southern Israel. Thousands of Palestinians in Gaza had been killed. The housing had been decimated, and feelings were very raw. The notion of getting talks going immediately was out of the question. So we had to try to create an atmosphere to bring the temperature down. So we asked all three to do something. We asked the Israelis for a settlement freeze. We asked all of the Arab nations, reflecting the Arab initiative proposed by the King of Saudi Arabia, to take steps toward normalization with Israel. What we said was, let El Al fly over your country on commercial flights. Reopen trade offices that existed. Why not have mail back and forth? Why not have telephone communication? Not full normalization, but steps toward normalization. And we asked the Palestinians, you have to eliminate incitement. You have to work harder, not just to impose order on the Palestinian people, but to persuade them that it is in their interest to have normal relations with Israel. None of them did what we asked. Abbas said, well, I don't have to do anything, it's all on the Israelis. The Israelis refused the settlement freeze, ultimately agreeing to a partial moratorium, which was unacceptable to the Palestinians, the Arabs, not just because it wasn't a full freeze, but that it excluded East Jerusalem, which to them is a central issue. And the Arab states took no steps toward normalization. So nobody did what we asked them to do. There were a partial step by the Israelis. I think if I were to do it again, I would say to the Israelis, you have to do more in terms of settlements, but you do it only if the Palestinians agree to come into talks and stay in talks. They can't walk out the first time the prime minister says something they don't like, or some minister announces a housing project. If you come in, you got to stay in. And I would take the further step of saying, you come in and we'll deal with borders first, and within 6 months we'll either have or we won't have an agreement. That requires the Israelis to be satisfied on security, and that requires the United States to make commitments to Israel. That's what's being discussed now. In other words, a step-by-step process committed in advance. I did something like that in Northern Ireland after the process collapsed. Blair and Ahern and Clinton asked me if I would go back in 1999 when the whole process was on the verge of collapse. And I sat for 4 months with the parties, and I wrote out on a legal pad every step. The first step was Jerry Adams was going to make a speech on November 27th. We wrote every word of the speech, and all parties agreed on it. The next step was to be a speech by David Trimble the next day. We negotiated that. We had a series of 18 steps over a few months, and when Adams stood up to speak on November 27th, everybody knew exactly in fact, the unionists had the paper in front of them. If he deviated from one word, it was going to be off. And that's the way we've got to go. I think you have to do the same. Because you can't, the mistake we made was trying to get people to take action voluntarily to create an atmosphere. The only way you can do it is to say, if you come in, this is what's going to happen. And if you come in, this is what's going to happen, and agree as much as you can on the steps to get them into negotiations in a frame of mind where they may be willing to see and act on their self-interest. But in the end, it's their country, it's their future, and it has to be their agreement. We can want it, we can encourage it. We are the only party that provides the glue. The Camp David Agreement is regarded as a great success. 1979, 37 years ago. And both countries, despite their differences, Egypt and Israel, want the agreement. And what has kept it together? $5 billion American dollars every year. $3 billion to Israel and $2 billion to Egypt. 5 times 37, it's 185 billion and counting, and we're about to go to 4 billion with the Israelis, and we'll probably have to make an adjustment on the other side as well. And we now provide substantial sums to the Palestinians as well. So they know America has to be involved because only America can guarantee the agreement, the glue that keeps the agreements together and leads to the implementation. But in the end, they have to want it. They have to agree to it, and they have to live up to it because it's their future, their people, and I think we should do all we can, and more than we have done, but in the end, they have to do it.
Well, alas, we have lots more questions, and in fact, Jim, what do you think? I think we're probably not going to be able to get to Disney.
No. But we have the plots for a couple of good movies.
Absolutely,
Okay, yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
In closing, let me say how grateful we are for your returning to Harvard, and we hope you come back often, and we hope you return to the program of negotiation because we have so much to learn from you in terms of your wisdom.
Well, I just want to thank you. It's a great honor for me to have been the first recipient of your Negotiator Award. It still sits on my wife's dresser in the bedroom, so I look at it every day as I pass by the dresser.
That's a standard.
That's right. Inspirational, no doubt.
That's right. And thank all of you for coming, and it's been a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you. I did enjoy your. Thank you.